You're listening to BreakPoint this week. My name's Wayne Stender, the product manager here at BreakPoint. And in this episode of BreakPoint this week, you'll notice that Maria's audio has some complications to it. Unfortunately, during the recording, her audio device malfunctioned. And so we, unfortunately, only have this audio to work with for today's show. We apologize for this reality and have corrected the issue for next week. Without further ado, here is John and Maria with BreakPoint this week.
You're listening to BreakPoint this week, where we're talking about the top stories of the week from a Christian worldview. Today, we're going to talk about the escalating situation between Russia and Ukraine. We're also going to talk about a conspiracy theory / parody called Birds Aren't Real. We have a lot to talk about today, but we're glad you're with us. Thanks for being here. Welcome to BreakPoint this week from the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I'm Maria Bear, alongside John Stonestreet, our president. How you doing this morning?
Doing well. How are you?
You're back in your office. You're not traveling.
I'm not traveling. That is true. I'm back home.
Do you spend most of your time, would you say, at home or most of your time traveling?
I didn't know this was going to be such a in-depth, hard-hitting interview. Let's talk about me.
Let's talk about your family.
How does your wife feel about this? Wow. Yeah, I'm not sure I was ready for this. We did not talk about this segment of the program, for the record, everyone.
I just like living vicariously through your travels and trying to figure out from your hotel room background what city you're in. It's been a lot of fun for me.
It actually, it's kind of been, I've been home for a couple weeks, actually. But so where was I last week when we were doing this? Because
you were in Phoenix recently because I was giving you a lot of restaurant recommendations.
I've been in Phoenix a lot over the last couple weeks for various things. And my wife has been with me on one of those trips. My kid came with me on a trip to Florida earlier. So it's been a busier travel time than it has been so far since the pandemic. The pandemic really kind of altered the schedule. But I have been able to take the kiddos with me. I'm back in Phoenix in a couple weeks, taking my wife with me again since it's her birthday weekend.
John, I'm going to Phoenix in a couple weeks.
Are we?
I'll see you there, bud.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're going the same week.
To my people.
Let's not talk about it.
Let's not give dates and locations.
Let's not talk about it and just see. Let's just see if we run into each other.
I think you have more faith in the integrity of our listening audience than I do. I haven't yet been harassed, but I have been online, so I'm going to play a little bit more careful.
But listen, when you travel, what is traveling like right now? Is it similar to the way it was at the beginning?
No, it's terrible. It's terrible.
No, but I mean, like when travel first sort of opened up and everybody was still really scared and all that kind of stuff, have you noticed a difference since then? Are people relaxing a little bit, or is it still pretty strict?
No, it's terrible. That's terrible. All right. No, there's not enough people working. That part's getting better. So everybody's stressed. Every passenger, I mean, it's now really crowded, but people are really on edge. I mean, there's a reason, Delta CEO asked, whoever to put, together a new no-fly list that they can just immediately put people on. It's kind of like when you have a classroom that's super out of control and you try to do all these kind of things to coddle your students, and then all of a sudden it's like, one and done, or your kid who struggles with something and you're like, okay, well, let's talk through this. And then it's eventually you're like, okay, there's got to be a no mercy rule here, right? And a no tolerance, hard, fast line. It's because we love you. I don't know, Delta's CEO loves us, but the point is that no, there are incidents after incidents after. There was one again this week, I think on a Spirit flight. People are just really on edge, and it's bizarre because it's like, okay, yeah, we all have a problem with masks, but you really think you're going to win this one? You really think you're going to, win this mask fight with this flight attendant? And there's also, that's another thing is that there's a real spectrum. I was actually talking to a friend of mine who's a flight attendant, and she's like, here's how I do it. I walk in from the very beginning, say hi to every passenger, look at them in the eye, try to build some sort of rapport but that's not the way all flight attendants are. I mean, there's some that they're armed for bear right off the bat. Like, the first time they come up to a passenger whose mask isn't as high as they think they are, and they yell at them. I mean, I've been on those flights too. Or they get on the the intercom, and they're like, "We will take you off the plane." And there's just this edge to people. So it's kind of like a stressful thing, and then you can just kind of feel it when you walk in the airport and when you walk out of the airport.
And that's a weird social experiment because you're in a confined space that has to be handled really carefully. You're up in the air for most of it. I was on a flight once, this was several years ago before the pandemic, but a group of men on the flight took over the flight. So this was an international flight, and the flight attendant crew was all very young women. I would guess like late teens, early 20s. And a group of Orthodox Jewish men like legitimately took over the flight. I mean, they got on the intercom for the majority of the flight, and there was several of them that just didn't sit down or were literally climbing over the backs of seats to get to each other and talk to each other. And at the beginning of the flight attendants tried to say, like, please sit down, we're taking off. And it just was anarchy. It got really unsettling. And there was nothing nefarious going on. They just were unruly, like this particular group of people. But you start to get a sense of like your true vulnerability when something like that happens. And you're like, well, I'm up in the air in a flying missile, and nobody's really in charge right now. At least that's how it felt. It's a very strange feeling. But, well, all that to say, I'm glad you're safely in your office at home right now, at least. At least you don't have a flight ahead of you today. Okay, well, let's get into it. We have a lot to get to today. The first thing I wanted to talk with you about is something that our team has obviously been following for weeks now, just like most of the rest of the world. But we've wanted to be really careful in how we talk about this and how we look at it. But it's gotten to such a point where obviously it's worth commenting on, and it's on everybody's mind. And that's the situation between Russia and Ukraine. So Vladimir Putin has amassed military troops on large stretches of border between Russia and Ukraine, suggesting obviously to the rest of the world that he's planning to invade. And there's been sort of a game of chicken between him and a lot of Western leaders, including the leaders of Ukraine. And, the United States has threatened sanctions and that sort of thing. I think we've made it pretty clear that we're not willing to intervene militarily against an invasion. But I think our government is kind of hoping that this is a game of chess, that Putin doesn't really plan to invade and that he's trying to get something else out of this. But that's not at all clear. And that also violates, I think, the principle of respecting the sort of unpredictability that Putin has shown that he has. We tend to think of the rest of the world leaders as if they act like our leaders do, and that's just not the case. So this is a really concerning situation, obviously. I wanted to get your take on the situation. I don't know that we need to get in prognostications and what we think might happen or might not happen. But I am really interested in this idea of what should Ukrainians be doing. I've heard a couple of stories on the World and Everything in It podcast and a couple different interviews with missionaries or just Christian believers inside Ukraine and others who are talking about, I'm willing to defend my country, or I'm ready, or I'm scared, or I'm running, or I'm trying to leave the country, or I'm staying. And just, kind of thinking through, what would I be doing? What would my family be doing if we faced a threat like this? And one of the questions that's come up is, when is defending your country in that way, or planning to, an honorable thing to do? When is it a foolhardy thing to do? We've talked before here at the Colson Center about just war theory. And one of the tenets of just war theory is that in order to go to war, you should have a reasonable expectation of success. This strikes me as a little different, because if your nation is being invaded and you have civilians who are willing to take up arms, I think the expectation of success has a lot of variables there. We're not talking about the question of whether an entire military should defend itself, but whether civilians should take up arms. So I just have so many questions here. What would you do? Let me put you on the spot. What would you do? You're a father. You're not in the military, but you're just a civilian in Ukraine. But you feel strongly that you should defend your homeland against a foreign invader. How are you facing this situation? How are you thinking through it from an ethical and moral Christian worldview?
The good news about this question is that it's completely hypothetical. So, it's a lot easier said than actually done. I was really appreciative this week. Al Mohler, who does a daily podcast called The Briefing, tackled this. And I thought he tackled it really well, because we've been looking at this Russia-Ukraine story for a couple weeks and trying to figure out, okay, not every news story needs to be talked about. That's not what we do. But there are some that get to the point where it's so significant or so important that to not say anything is louder than to say something. But we want to say something that's helpful and something that is distinctly Christian, not just something that has some sort of, take from a foreign policy standpoint, coming from a political angle. One of the things that Mohler points to here, before we get into the hypothetical of what I would do, is how much history here is behind this. And that's something that I think the West has always struggled with. We've talked about that when it comes to China. We've talked about that when it comes to the Muslim world. Most of the world has a longer historical memory than we do. And that's why it's sometimes hard to think about this. We look at this and say, okay, what happened in the last 3 months that caused this, escalating conflict? That's not how this story is built on. It's built on hundreds of years.
Yeah. I have a friend from church who was born and raised in Germany. And she told me once that their chapter in history class on World War II was 4 days long. I mean, she was like, we spent most of the year before 1700, because these nations have such a long record of their history and have been around for so much longer than ours. But that just illustrates your point.
He points to a lot of that. He also points to some of the geographical oddities that are really important here. We don't often think about that anymore, and how important things are, like water access and, where you actually are in the world geographically, topographically, and all that. That still matters. Who owns the ocean still matters an awful lot. Who owns access to the rest of the world through water? This stuff really matters. And so that's at play here as well. But, to go to your example of World War II, that was a typical 20th century scenario. The 20th century really emerged as this nation state conflict. And then at the end of the 20th century, after the fall of communism and really the global standoff in the Cold War was reduced to one, unrivaled superpower, the United States, and nobody else really came close. And obviously we talk a lot about China. That has become an emerging threat. And we talk a lot about Russia now. That has become an emerging threat. And, if you go back to the end of the 20th century, Samuel Huntington wrote a book, a Harvard guy, called The Clash of Civilizations. And what he predicted was that, now that this kind of era of nation state global conflict was over, well, that actually was one of the things that he predicted. And that the 21st century would be defined by conflict, not between nation states, but between civilizations. And these civilizational fault lines sometimes run between two nations, but a lot of times it runs right down the middle of nations. And so that's where all of this conflict is going to be. And he also predicted, by the way, that the hottest of all the civilizational conflicts would be between Islam and the West. Now, you look at what happened then. He wrote this, by the way, at a time, I think it was just a few years after another Harvard kind of geopolitical writer predicting what was going to happen in the future wrote the end of history, and basically saying, look, the West has won, communism is over. That guy's predictions clearly have been proven wrong. He basically said he predicted kind of a new kind of utopian sort of thing. And, he was wrong. Huntington looked right at the beginning of the 21st century. I mean, it was 2001 where we had the attacks of 9/11, and the world goes back to war. And this war drags on and on and on in various forms in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then, of course, you have in the middle of the 90s, these were things that many people didn't pay attention to in the West, but they were civilizational conflicts, and the Serbs and Croats and all the things happening in the Balkans and so on. But then you had Russia and you had China. And these are two very nationalistic, historically grounded, rooted people with very strong leaders that had these strong visions and memories of the past and the past glory. So you had Chairman Xi going back to Chairman Mao, basically saying the same things, doing the same things, acting the same way. And it was a reaction in a large part to social unrest caused by having, an incredible gender imbalance, economic troubles and having to deal with the difference between this hyper-industrialization in the cities in China versus poverty elsewhere. Just so many different factors going on, and having to wrestle with this problem of this cultural diversity that he needed to stamp out in order to keep kind of this Chinese identity, this communist Chinese identity. Russia dealt with it kind of the same way. So Putin kind of rises to the floor. He has these images of himself shirtless on horses, kind of like, here's who we are. And he starts to really lead back into this nation state sort of thing. So it's really interesting that it seems like Samuel Huntington's thesis needs a corrective. Many people critiqued him, and I think he ended up being a lot more right than wrong, obviously. But I think now there's a new chapter because of these two kind of forces on the planet. It has to do with worldview because it has to do with culture. It has to do with history. It has to do with ideas. It has to do with, here's how we're going to deal with minorities. In the case of China, the Muslim Uyghur minority, the Christian minority. And then, of course, in the case of Russia, dealing with these annexed lands that were once part of Russia in his view, and then, okay, well, there's no independence here. You're going to be part of us again. The other thing too that history reminds us of is that these sort of conflicts, again, in the 90s, there were these civilizational conflicts happening, nothing until it affected us on 9/11. And America has this remarkable ability to not know much, as I think Dr. Moeller put it in the briefing about foreign policy, until it affects them. But these events have an ability to shake global stability. Go back to World War I. What started that? Go back to World War II. What started that? These global conflicts happen in ways that we don't often anticipate, don't often predict. There's a book called The Content Trap. And in The Content Trap, it starts out by talking about the big Yellowstone fire. And it says, hey, what caused the Yellowstone fire? And the narrative is, this was back in the 90s, was there a cigarette was dropped on the ground. But the problem with that analysis is hundreds of thousands of cigarettes were dropped on the ground all over the world that day, probably that hour. One of them led to what became the largest wildfire, in the Yellowstone history.
Right.
So what was the cause? It was a cigarette dropped in a context of what was essentially a tinderbox ready to explode. There was a lot of pre-existing conditions. Same thing here. It's never this, the shooting of Archduke Ferdinand that caused the conflict. It was this tinderbox of conditions where something like that sends it over the edge. And with the instability of China threatening Hong Kong, Taiwan, other parts of the world, certainly building up military, increasing their naval presence, something like the instability here and an incident between Russia and Ukraine, this is one of those moments. It could kick off a conflict that, we forget can take place. I'll end with one last story. And I know I've rambled on here, because I'm just trying to give some historical context and ways to think about this. But I remember being in a history of Western Civ class, probably my sophomore year in college, talking about World War II. This would have been 1994, 1995, something like that. And I remember thinking about this going, I can't even imagine the world would ever be dumb enough to go back to war, like it to that scale. Yeah. I mean, this was the 90s. If you don't remember, our biggest concern was, what Clinton was doing with Monica Lewinsky. Like that was the biggest headline. We were rich, we were fat, we were happy, we were overly amused and entertained. Something like that was unthinkable. Fast forward less than 10 years, probably 2002. And I'm teaching a class at that same college, by the way, to a group of freshmen. And I asked them, can you even imagine the world ever being at peace again? And their answer was absolutely not. That was 10 years. That was less than 10 years. That's how quick things can change. And it has to do, as Warren Smith would say, it's not one thing, it's everything. It's a whole bunch of things. And then something drops and it's a big deal. Yeah. So there's just a couple different sides of this thing that I think we need to know. We'll link to this Al Mohler briefing edition episode. It's a podcast and a newsletter, and we'll link to it so people can read it. It's a helpful backdrop, and we're working on some stuff on that too.
Yeah, and he does a really helpful job of pointing out that it's not as simple as saying there are two nations and one is going to invade the other. He points out the fact that Putin really views Ukraine and has always viewed Ukraine as part of Russia. And there are large groups of Ukrainians and people living in Ukraine who consider themselves part of Russia as well. You know, there's always been a social conflict in Ukraine, at least in modern history, over what language you speak there, because that is a signal of identity. A lot of people speak Ukrainian, a lot of people speak Russian, and to speak one or the other in public says something about you and your view of the conflict and all that. I'll just say, as a last note, when I was in Ukraine in 2014, I was in Kyiv, and it was about 6 months after Russia had annexed Crimea. At all the little pop-up stores or people selling like wares on the streets in Kyiv, which they're everywhere, you could buy toilet paper with Putin's face on it. I'm just going to leave it at that. That was the general sense in Kyiv at that time in 2014.
Doesn't that tell you something about the
I don't know
the universal human ability to be innovative and creative and entrepreneurial at the same time?
Totally. There's a famous chocolatier in Kyiv that I went to a bunch, like just a chocolate candy shop, and they would have big chocolate molds of Putin's head with like horns, like devil horns coming out of it. That was the other big thing.
Yeah, to really think about these things well, you need that historical backdrop. The other thing that Dr. Mohler gets into is the religious history. That matters. We don't think about that, particularly in the West. We don't think about history because as a secular-minded people, we think about technology. We think about innovation, and that makes us think about the future, not the past. And we also treat religion as if it's a cute little personal preference. So we don't think about the significance of religion in distinguishing nation states and separating peoples and creating conflicts. And that's part of this story as well. And there's other things. So access to resources and, all kinds of things that are part of this. But those two limitations of a secular worldview, to not take religion seriously and not take history seriously, is one of the reasons we'll struggle to understand this one and often struggle to understand what's happening in the world.
Yeah. And understanding it correctly is necessary if we're going to respond well.
Did I successfully dodge your question about what I would do?
I was just going to end the segment by saying there is no way I'm leaving you off the hook here. Like, I will bring it up next week too, because this has been plaguing me. I mean, it's easy to say when you're talking about just war and you're thinking about, should America, for example, send the military over to Russia, or to Ukraine? Should America have withdrawn from Afghanistan? It's one thing to talk about it in those terms, like at that level, but it's another to think about, what would you do individually? And, my husband just finished reading a book called 1776 by David McCullough, a really famous historian, incredible writer of narrative historical nonfiction. And this was about 1776. And the odds of success for the founding fathers were so low. I mean, absolutely unreasonable. And obviously it worked. So that adds a little hitch in my giddy up. Like, I don't know the answer. Anyway, I'm not letting you off the hook. So keep that in your mind, I guess. And I'm going to ask you about it again, so think about it this week, John. You have a week to decide whether you would take up arms in defense of your Ukrainian homeland. And then we'll come back to it. Let's take a quick break. We'll be right back with more BreakPoint this week.
Christians in America can't have a cultural impact without restoring the church through the recovery of the wisdom that we've lost. If we're to endure the crises of the 21st century with hope, the renewal of our minds and a fully formed Christian faith, well, they're not optional. They are the call of every serious believer who longs to seek first the kingdom of God. And the Colson Fellows is an on-ramp to doing this. The Colson Fellows are a diverse group. They're a courageous community of Christians. They're corporate CEOs and university professors. They're homeschool moms, teachers, pastors, ministry leaders. They're people that go to church. They're you and me. And they're all pursuing God's glory in every area of life. We're accepting applications for the new 2022-2023 Colson Fellows term. It's a 10-month deep dive into Christian worldview that's guided by peers and leaders to help you build a 3-year ministry vision for your location to equip you to stand in this time and in this place with Christian conviction and Christian love. For more information on the Colson Fellows program, visit our website at colsonfellows.org Again, that's colsonfellows.org.
We're back on BreakPoint this week. John, I want to turn now to something I'm excited to talk with you about, because I listened to this podcast from the New York Times this week on The Daily. They shared this story, and I confess I was completely unaware of it until I heard this podcast episode that you brought to my attention, which I think means I'm officially old. I mean, I suppose I knew I wasn't in Gen Z, but I feel a little old for not having heard of this before. But there is this satirical movement online that has gained a huge amount of traction. I think they were talking about hundreds of thousands of followers, which I suppose means just people who've interacted with this movement in one way or another. But this movement is called Birds Aren't Real. And on The Daily from the New York Times, they interviewed this college student, Peter McIndoe, who kind of started this whole thing. And essentially what's happening here is he was in Memphis, Tennessee, I think he said, shortly after Donald Trump was elected. He was walking around downtown and came upon a big women's march, which those were happening all over the country at that time. And, people were so passionate and angry, and they were marching, and there were huge groups of people. And he was thinking about, he said, like a Saturday Night Live type skit. What if there was somebody at a march like this that had just as much energy and passion and was holding up signs, but we're talking about something completely ludicrous, like completely unrelated to what this march is about. And this kid, Peter McIndoe, said that he shared with the New York Times he had grown up in a very strict Christian household. He had a lot of siblings. They were homeschooled. It sounded like he was pretty sheltered. He also shared, which I'm sure we're going to get into here, that he had some questions about Christianity as a young person. I think he said when he was like 10, he went to his pastor and said, "I don't think I believe in God." And his pastor's response was, "Well, I think you're possessed by a demon." And it sounds like he was just not met with the kind of support that he needed at that time. So he obviously does not now consider himself a believer at all. So coming from that background, he started this thing where he's at the Women's March, he picks up a poster and he wrote the 3 most random words that came into his mind. And they were "birds aren't real." And he started walking around yelling about birds aren't real. And people started asking him, what does your sign mean? What are you talking about? And he said, "Oh, well, this movement, the Birds Aren't Real movement's been around for 50 years. And we believe that the government systematically killed 20 billion birds starting in the 1940s and have replaced them all with drones that are watching our every move." And he started, videos of him went viral on the internet. He created all these social media channels, and it has since blown up. And he maintains that, nobody actually is believing that this is real, but he stays in character. So he's been interviewed all over local media and newspapers and everything all over the country. And when he's interviewed, typically he stays in character as this kind of wackadoo conspiracy theorist, but he agreed to sort of be himself for this interview with The Daily and was just talking about that he became fascinated with the idea of conspiracy theories and what draws people to them, what makes people so energetic about this kind of stuff. There's so many directions I want to go down here with you. One of the things that stood out to me about this story was that he strikes me as somebody, he's a college kid, he's young, so maybe that's part of it, but he's struggling. I think there's a mark of Generation Z that is they struggle to take things seriously. And they struggle to want to take things seriously. Like earnestness is not currency anymore. Like that is the way to be uncool, is to be sincere. The way to be cool is to act like you don't really care about anything. And I think in my pessimistic view, that can be pretty dangerous culturally. And what this feels like to me is, he shared one story about going to a pro-life march. He saw a bunch of pro-lifers marching, holding up photos of dismembered babies. And he found that really distasteful. And so he started a Birds Aren't Real march right next to them. And he said something like, "I wanted to hold up a mirror and show them how ludicrous they were being." And I think that's pretty problematic if you think about it too hard, because you're suggesting that to care about anything is to lose. It's too uncool to do. But at the same time, people have the desire to do that, or they want to do that. And so I worry that they're looking to things like satire and parody in this case for like an outlet, like a catharsis of their passion without actually being willing to care vocally about something proper. So do you think that's a problem?
Well, I want to hit your analysis because I'm not sure I agree with you. And here's why. The cynicism of caring, the apathy or the cool factor, I don't think that's a Gen Z thing. Okay. It didn't start with Gen Z. It started with Gen Xers. I mean, this is the classic Gen X, listen to Alanis Morissette while you're sitting out, on a hillside contemplating life's meaning. And also kind of being hyper and over entertained. In other words, this goes back. This isn't anything new. In fact, I think many people have pointed to Gen Z and their willingness to jump onto causes and as kind of a corrective on that of caring more. Now, I'm not saying that what, your analysis doesn't have merit, because I think that's clearly what's coming out here is that there's a cynicism of information. There's an intentionality of parodying what people desperately care about. So there is some of that. I just don't think it's a Gen Z distinctive. And I think there's evidence that Gen Z is coming out of that. Years ago, I was at a college teaching, and I was hosting a forum on race when 3 individuals walked into the forum dressed as KKK members, holding a bat and a chain and a pipe, I think. And I mean, it was chaos. And then when we finally chased those guys down, and they realized they were students at the school, and said, "What on earth were you thinking?" And they were like, "Oh, we just thought it'd be funny." And that's when I realized that you can tell a lot about somebody by what they choose to laugh at. Now, I think there's a big difference between laughing at something as historically serious as racism and lynching and making up something, really funny like birds aren't real as a way to laugh at people's seriousness about causes. At the same time, I think the analysis of putting it in the middle of something that many people take seriously, like a women's march and a counter Donald Trump thing, these are things that people take really, really seriously because there's a real feeling that, there's something that's making women victims. This is behind the Me Too movement and so on, or that, the political classes are ruling us in ways that we can't trust. And, to put it beside a pro-life march, or probably it is accurate to say in this case with the graphic imagery, an anti-abortion march, that's trivializing something. Whether that's the intent or not, it is trivializing something that really has life or death implications. So I don't disagree that there's a cynicism here. I think there is. I also wonder just how much. I mean, we started, if you're listening to the podcast version of this, we started talking about life on airplanes now. And I think there's a real need to find relief from how seriously everybody is taking everything. One of the marks of a hyper-politicized world is that everything's a life or death issue. Now, the problem with them becoming cynical is then you take things that actually are life or death issues, taking issues that really do matter, and then trying to trivialize them all because you just can't handle how much, tension there is in the room. I think that's one of the features of Gen Zers. And, I'm looking here at the New York Times article, and he's standing on top of a van in St. Louis, burning a St. Louis Cardinals flag. That's pretty funny come on. The baseball team has a pro bird logo. I mean, that's pretty funny.
They held a big march around the Twitter headquarters because the Twitter logo was a bird.
By the way, that's like a telegraphed PR. That's too easy. That's what's known as opportunism. Here's what I found also to be a really interesting part of this, and also a troubling part of it. The New York Times holds this kid up as now an authority on conspiracy theories. There's something about how, you wonder why people don't trust mainstream media. This might be one of them. And that if you hold to a pro-life view or a pro-women's march view, or, just put them all together, then to hold to any cause is the same as believing in a conspiracy theory. That's just not helpful because, again, some issues actually do matter. I thought, too, there was something fascinating in this whole story, which came out in the podcast, which is his background. being highly sheltered or whatever.
Religious.
But look, when he says, I went to my youth pastor said, you're possessed by a demon. Like, I'm sure there are youth pastors in the history of the world who said that. That's very unusual. I have heard enough exaggerations of one's religious upbringing to know that may or may not be the truth. There just might be a snarky, cynical approach to life that he has, or he's just a super funny kid trying to make everybody laugh. And there was kind of a completely embrace of this is what this kid's upbringing was without any sort of other questions. Now, maybe he's right. Maybe that it actually was the upbringing. Whatever it was, he then goes and says, but then I got access to the internet. And the internet changed everything. Yeah. So living in a culture in which feels like he was being sheltered from larger sources of information, different views of life in the world, suddenly gets access to the one source that gives it all to you all at once without any discernment, without any sort of contextualization. Mm-hmm. And what's his landing place? His landing place is, we just need to laugh more. And you know what? We do need to laugh more. But what you laugh at matters, right? And I think for Christian parents who actually want to raise their kids in the faith, there's a double-edged warning. Number one is you can't dismiss questions that are sincere. The Bible doesn't do it. Jesus didn't do it. We shouldn't do it either. When someone really has questions, the good news is the answers are there. We've said this many times, that we live in the golden age of answers. It's there. So don't dismiss questions as automatically sinning, because it's not. There is a difference between a seeker and a mocker, and those are distinctions we need to make. On the other hand, the internet is far more powerful as a culture-shaping force than a whole lot of sermons put together. And we need to understand that too. So there's kind of a double-edged warning here, I think.
Something that just rubbed me wrong about it, the story in the podcast anyway, was that when they brought up his upbringing, which was relevant, I don't mean to suggest they shouldn't have, but they sort of implied that him creating this conspiracy theory that then gained all these followers, that this is a perfect analogy to religion. I mean, that was the implication, right? Like, he even said at one point, like, I have a lot more empathy for people like my family because I can see what people get out of believing something together and following a movement in that way. So in other words, implying that these are the same substance sort of thing, like believing that birds aren't real and believing in God is the same sort of thing. And of course it's not. But I think that leveling that as an accusation is a really interesting tactic, because it sounds effective first to say, like, look, I can get people to believe or to be passionate about anything, which means that if you see people who believe something or are passionate about it, you should look at that very skeptically because of what I just accomplished. But I actually think our human readiness to believe in a reality outside of us is part of our design. Like, God gave us that so that we would be curious and find him, not as a stumbling block that now we're just super gullible and susceptible to believing anything. But I think it's part of our design. I used to feel threatened by that. It's the same way that kids feel threatened, when you first learn there are other religions, or maybe why parents, like maybe the parents in this case, don't tell their kids that there are other religions, because we're threatened by the idea that some people are taken in by beliefs that we'd say are wrong. But I actually think when you drill into it philosophically, that's a point in our favor, because that shows that we were made knowing, or at least suspecting, that there's a larger truth and a larger narrative to the world. The question then becomes just finding the right one. That's the harder part. But do you see what I mean? Does that make sense?
I just think it's interesting. Of all the things to talk about, I didn't want to talk about this week just because I think it's somehow dangerous or anything like that. The Times piece and the podcast, do talk about a whole lot of people who have found it as just kind of something funny. It's almost like a Babylon Bee, right? Where, Christians who have to take things so seriously with a culture that is oftentimes so hostile or uncomfortable to live in have resort to the Babylon Bee as kind of a snarky sort of, comedic relief. And I think that's what's happening here for an awful lot of people as well. But there is an underlying thing here that needs to be addressed, which is a cynicism of anything that matters. That's a really dangerous place to be. And I'm not saying that's where this guy is or most of the people in the movement are. But when you live in a kind of a situation in which you're sheltered from a broad amount of information and you're suddenly blasted with information, you don't always stop believing in the old thing or start believing in something new. It can make you cynical of any authority, any information. When you live in a situation in which every cause and every issue is life or death, and you can't give an inch because to give an inch means you belong to the wrong side or whatever, when you do that, then the temptation then is to punt to a place where you don't think anything matters. And that's, I think, the tedious place to be in the middle. And I think it's one of the things that Christians need in order to navigate this cultural moment without becoming cynical of information, without becoming cynical of cost, without becoming cynical of issues. I think people sense it. Let's pull the situation into kind of the evangelical world. What's happened? Well, you have people that believed that abortion really matters because it does, that unborn life needs to be protected because it does, and jumped all in on the cause because they should have. And then some people then saw that other issues were being added to that, of grave importance. Some of those were of grave importance. Some of those, like economic policies or specific things, weren't nearly at the same level of significance as those things. But then the reaction in kind of mainstream center evangelicalism, including in some of the big evangelical voices and institutions of our day, has then been to look at that sort of stuff and dismissed concerns across the board, or being unwilling to talk about the things that really do matter because, it's a culture war issue or something like that. And in other words, you can see the same path go forward for us, is the inability to distinguish what really matters from what really doesn't matter. And that can either go the direction of lumping them all together and, making them all, make or break issues, or it can be dismissing all of them and just kind of punting to a position of being nice, as if that's Christian faithfulness these days.
Right. That illustrates, I think, what I was talking about before, which is social pressure is such a huge factor here. The cool factor is a big deal. Even the fact, I was kind of struck that the New York Times didn't bring up, I don't think I heard the word privilege once, but I was expecting that from the very start. Like, here's a white young male college student who shows up at the Women's March and makes fun of it. You're not going to accuse him of abusing his privilege or not taking it seriously, but I think nobody wants to do that to a cool, funny, charming, charismatic kid, because then you are the uncool one. Like, come on, man, can't you just have a laugh? And I get it, but I also think that's risky. You know what I mean? He just reminded me, though, of, everybody knew that kid in high school, and they were like the funnest kid ever.
Everybody knew that kid at Summit because he was a homeschool kid who came and took over. There was just a handful of them, and obviously the kid's super talented.
It was like Rumspringa.
Wow, he's super talented, super funny, and probably one of our editorial team just like, I just want to go hang out with this guy. And I think he'd probably be a lot of fun, to hang out with.
Well, I'm also kind of like, I'm happy he went this route because he clearly has like a magnetism. This, he could have gone the Charlie Manson route, but he went this route. So I'll take it. I think we'll call that a win.
Well, and I hate the stereotype because we're in a place where the easiest way to get press is to complain about your conservative, evangelical, fundamentalist upbringing in one way or the other. And now I'm enlightened, and you'll immediately be treated as an expert in theology, an expert in cultural matters, an expert in conspiracy theories. It's just the way that it's gone. And honestly, there's more and more kind of center evangelical institutions that will invite you to speak at their chapels and, treat you as an expert on their podcast and stuff. There really is a problem here on this. So, yeah, but that's another issue.
Well, it's a fun episode of The Daily. I encourage people to listen to it because it was a lot of, obviously, food for thought. But let's take another quick break, John. We'll be right back with more BreakPoint this week from the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I'm Maria Bear alongside John Stone Street. We'll be right back.
We know what we're saved from, but what are we saved for? You know, redemption isn't for some future time. It's for right here and right now. And we want to invite you to Wilberforce Weekend 2022. You'll hear dozens of speakers who will share inspiring personal stories of redemption. And attendees can participate in insightful panel discussions with Q&A opportunities. There will be a special screening for the new C.S. Lewis movie, The Most Reluctant Convert. It will be hosted by director Max McLean. We'll also spend some time reflecting on the conversion and life of our founder, Chuck Colson. You'll hear from Ryan Baumbarger, Rachel Gilson, Max McLean, Jennifer Patterson, Virginia Prodan, Dan Ritchie, Joni Erickson Tada, John Stonestreet, and many more expert speakers who will discuss this topic of the life redeemed. Wilberforce Weekend 2022 will be held in Orlando, Florida on May 13th to the 15th. For more information, visit wilberforceweekend.org.
We're back on BreakPoint this week. John, I want to talk now about some of the commentaries we shared this week at breakpoint.org. And some of them have a lot in common with the conversation we were just having about conspiracy theories and satire and parody. One of them you were kind of touching on right at the end there is this conversation around our Christian witness. So you and I worked on this commentary together because this is something we've seen a lot recently is appeals to our Christian witness. That's the language that's used. And you and I were kind of thinking through, like, in a lot of ways, this is starting to feel when people use that in public forums, like when you're hearing mainstream Christian institutions or Christian thinkers appeal to, listen, we need to protect our Christian witness. The implication there is starting to feel a little bit like a purity test. Usually what follows is you must behave in this way or you must say this thing in order to protect our Christian witness. It made me think of it last segment when you were talking about, you know, some Christians have really jumped all in on caring for the unborn. And then other Christians have added other issues to that and said, well, you can't care about that if you don't also care about this. And I was thinking through this week how often you hear the phrase now, this is a gospel issue. You need to care about this because it's a gospel issue. And we've said it so often that I'm afraid it started to lose its meaning a little bit. I find myself wanting to say, I'm pretty sure the only gospel issue is the gospel. I mean, I understand what people mean when they say that the gospel has implications for all these other issues, and that's certainly true. But I do think there's a problem with setting up these purity tests in worrying about the Christian witness. And what you and I were kind of exploring is, if you look at scripture, when Jesus talks about maintaining a witness or concern for our reputation as believers to the outside world, he almost always makes an appeal to unity or love between Christians. He never really talks about, you know, make sure you're not offending people, make sure you're nice to everybody, make sure everybody feels that what you do is nice to them, you know, be mindful of the changing cultural definitions of nice and loving and all that kind of stuff. It's about unity. And that's a kind of a painful irony, because what we do when we set up purity tests like this is we cause disunity sometimes. But it's hard too. How are you thinking through this?
Yeah, I've seen this work up close and personal on the political stuff, where, you know, what it means to be nice and what it means to be mean is different depending on which side of the issue that you're on. Someone can be completely inappropriate, publicly slander another individual, but they're on the right side of it, so they're still good. The other person can be committed to an issue, maybe super inappropriate, and some of the compromises made around it, but never say anything interpersonally about somebody else, but he's the mean guy because of it. It's just a really strange time. And I think we need to rethink what this looks like. And I think we also have to be really clear. Now, I'm probably one that is more comfortable saying, hey, this is a gospel issue about things that have to do with creational norms, with clear moral standards, with things like that. Sure. But I do think that gospel issue, as you said, is kind of a convenient category to pull a Mack truck, you know, through and dump all kinds of things onto that. And depending on what's kind of culturally popular. Yeah, it is. It's a tough thing. So I think the distinction needs to be made. Like, we have to care about the church's witness, but how the world receives the church's witness is not a valid criteria to judge the church's witness. Totally. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, totally. We touched on this a little in the piece too, but I think not only is our forgiveness of each other and patience with each other going to be a really powerful witness and one that Jesus calls us to, but I really think that giving each other the benefit of the doubt is such a lost art. And I consider that to be charity. The Bible talks about giving charity to one another, but so many things that we talk about as gospel issues or as harming or hurting the church's witness are behaviors. And the fact is, people who have the same intentions as you can come to different conclusions about their behavior. People who have the same bedrock of care, of caring about each other, caring for a fidelity to truth, they can come to a different conclusion. Giving that person who, especially the people who claim Christ like you do, giving them the benefit of the doubt on things like that will go a much longer way than, writing a think piece about why their behavior, writing a public piece about why their behavior is harming the church's witness. That just doesn't sit well with me.
Yeah. There's a history to this. We may not get to the second thing we want to get to, but there's a history to this. It's that happened in the middle of the 20th century. And it emerged as part of a controversy between fundamentalism and modernism. And basically, with the onset of science and the enshrinement of Darwinian evolution over science, higher biblical criticism, skepticism of miracles and the supernatural that started to infiltrate and then eventually take over mainline denominations, there was a real fight that happened that created a whole scenario culturally. Even while the world was at war, there was these Bible wars, and they were over really, really important issues, and culminated in the Scopes trial. And then coming out of that, there was an attempt by evangelical leaders to say, okay, what does it look like to stay on the right side of these very important doctrinal issues, because they had to do with, miracles and the resurrection and the virgin birth, things, substitutionary atonement. Jesus is not just a moral example, but as our savior, things that, gosh, you can't compromise on these things. But also then wanting to say, okay, well, how can evangelicalism hold on to these beliefs that are really, really essential and still continue to engage mainstream culture that just embarrassed conservative Christianity on a national scale through the Scopes trial and beyond. Now, that story is a whole lot more complicated, and you're getting me on a topic and I say you're getting me on a topic, I just got on a topic that I can go on and on and on about because it's so fascinating. It tells you a lot about the historical anecdotes. But something emerged then was the secondary battle between the fundamentalists and the evangelicals. Now, this has a long storied history as well. It had to do with Billy Graham being too comfortable working with modernists. It had to do with, what we do with alcohol, and what we do with, moral standards about, how we dress and whether we go to movies or not. And what does it look like to maintain standards of holiness in a culture that's dramatically expanding, behavioral norms.
Is this related to that pamphlet you found in that old store that was a warning against mixed bathing? In other words, swimming with opposite gender.
That is that store. Yes, that store, which was, I'll just say it was in North Carolina somewhere, would be an example of these issues that emerged. I mean, in that same store, you would find warnings against Billy Graham as a false prophet.
Wow.
In other words, this war that started between fundamentalism and modernism became a war between fundamentalism and evangelicalism. And a doctrine emerged on the fundamentalist side called secondary separation. Separation is, look, if you don't agree with me, if you don't believe in these essential core fundamental beliefs of Christianity, the virgin birth, the reliability, inerrancy of Scripture, the fact that Jesus died for our sins is not just a good moral example, virgin birth, resurrection, that, bodily resurrection. Jesus actually rose from the dead. It's not like an inspiring story. It actually happened. Then I have to separate from you. In other words, you're not Christian. This is what J. Gresham Machen did back in the 1920s when he wrote Christianity and Liberalism, saying, look, liberalism's not Christianity. Liberal Christianity is a different religion. That's what Elisa Childers did on progressive Christianity. But there emerged this among fundamentalists where I not only need to separate from you if we're doctrinally off base, but if you don't separate from everyone I think you should separate, then I have to separate from you, even if you believe the same thing.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? It becomes separation on secondary issues. When you don't have clarity on what a gospel issue is and what the church's witness really is measured upon, What we have right now is an emerging of a new secondary separation.
Really?
It didn't work, by the way. It didn't work. Eventually, you find yourself alone. You have to separate from everybody because somebody breaks the rules all the time. And that's what's happened here. And I think it happens on both sides, but I think primarily right now it's happening kind of, and it's interesting that mainstream kind of center evangelicalism, which was the victim of fundamentalist secondary separation, they were the ones being kind of isolated, even though, they would have believed the same thing. But we're seeing now that you can, not have orthodox views on the resurrection, not have orthodox views on creation. And I don't mean, a particular age of the earth. I'm talking about just that, Adam and Eve existed and that Adam and Eve, were male and female and that biological realities are real and that they are connected, that there's a connection between the first Adam and the second Adam. Inherent sin, things like that would have been doctrinally non-negotiable in the last fight. It's okay to negotiate on those today, but what makes you an untouchable, what makes you somebody that we have to separate on is niceness or a particular way of understanding the race issue or a particular way of voting. Does that make sense? There's like a new world of secondary separation being brought into it. Now, on the flip side, I think the same thing is true on the conservative side. You can believe, right now we had a couple pieces over the last couple weeks, talking about how some evangelical leaders violated or made mistakes during the pandemic. And I think, that's a very valid conversation to have. But now we have to separate from them, even though they agree with us on, inerrancy, the virgin birth, the resurrection, substitutionary atonement, the church's existence and importance and mission, might have even voted for Trump.
Right. Right.
These aren't sustainable categories, guys. They're just not sustainable categories. And it's okay to point it out in a journalistic sense. It's another thing to, demand that these are untouchables. And that's the lines that are being flirted with. And it tells us that we're being politically defined as opposed to being gospel defined.
It misrepresents the nature of the Christian faith altogether, because I think we mentioned this in the piece. Essentially what it's saying is you cannot be a Christian and do or think or say X. And unless X is the belief in those non-negotiable things you're talking about, unless X is the belief that there's no God but the Lord and he sent his son, Jesus Christ, who was a real person who really died and was raised again and, forgives our sins. Unless it's X, there really is nothing that fits there. You can't say you can't be a Christian and make this theological error, or you can't do this thing that we find distasteful or even sinful, because that's not what Christianity is. No one is claiming that we don't want it to be that, because no one is claiming that once you describe yourself as a Christian, there are certain sins of which you're not capable. Because that's a misunderstanding of human nature. And I think all the time about the man next to Jesus on the cross who proclaimed faith in Jesus, an hour before he died. He didn't have time to go through 80 years of sanctification and to study theology and to come to right belief on all sorts of secondary issues. But I still believe he's in heaven, because that's what being a Christian means.
We need to be clear, though, that, the thief on the cross is not upheld in Scripture as the model that we were supposed to strive for, right?
Sure.
And I know you mean that.
Something, though.
It doesn't get us off the hook because, as James Orr, the great Scottish theologian, put it, anyone committed to Christ is committed to a whole lot of other things besides a view of creation, a view of reality, a view of morality, and so on. So I'm not saying that these issues aren't extremely important.
And a person's behavior can demonstrate that they don't actually believe. Although I don't know that we'd ever want to be the ones to decide that, to officially claim. Right.
You can have that one.
I'm talking about like extreme hyperbole, like a person is an ongoing serial murderer. Do I believe that they believe in Christ?
That's truly redeemed. Yeah, probably not.
Right.
But there is certain very culturally popular, convenient ways in which, ongoing sin is dismissed as being important to believe, right?
Totally.
So your point stands. We need to pursue what it means to have a more fully developed and a more consistent, by consistent, I mean a consistent set of beliefs and a consistent set of beliefs that then is consistently shown in how we live and how we relate to others. That's a non-negotiable. But deciding who we play with on less core issues and on more secondary issues. I mean, we tried this throughout history. It doesn't work. And I just think we need to rethink this right now. If unity is a demonstration of the gospel plausibility, we're not doing too well. And you and I know, and we said this a million times, you don't prioritize unity over truth, right? You have unity in the truth, not unity in spite of the truth. Right? Yeah. The truth brings unity.
There's something just really Screwtapian about it, where it's like, okay, what's most important for the gospel witness is unity. Let's get everybody really stirred up about the gospel witness, and let them think that in order to protect it, they have to yell at each other publicly. Like this, it's like you couldn't have written a better script.
Right. Well, I think one of the most helpful parts of that commentary was saying, look, it's not just that Christians should be taking different positions on some of these, definitive issues of our time. We should take those positions differently. We should take different positions, and we should do it differently. And that, we're kind of playing by the same playbook as stuff that hasn't been, very helpful. Yep. Certainly not very Christ-like.
Okay, thanks, John. Well, that's going to be all the time we have for the program today. Let's quickly move on to some recommendations. I have a quick, fun one that I'll share. Recommendation is my favorite part of the show now because I feel like you get so nervous about what I'm going to share, and I just love having that power over you. Okay, so this week, I'm officially in cabin fever mode. I'm going really stir crazy. You just can't go outside. It's warming up a little bit, but now there's still snow everywhere and it's all slushy and gross, and walking to the park is not a possibility. I'm just really grumpy about it. So anyway, we've been playing a lot of board games in our house, and I think it's been long enough we can all kind of laugh about it now that it's not in poor taste to recommend a game called Pandemic. Have you ever played it?
No.
Okay, we actually had this game. I know, right? We had this game before 2020. It's a super, super fun game. It's like a strategy game. You can't play it with kids. It's too complicated. But essentially what you're doing is no matter how many players you have, you're all on the same team playing against the game, and you're trying to quash a pandemic before it kills off the world. There's a lot of strategy involved. It takes like a good hour and a half. It's like one of those Settlers of Catan games where it just takes a long time, but it's really fun. So that's my recommendation.
I'm just wondering if the little game piece is it like Anthony Fauci? Like you can be Fauci.
They're very cartoonish.
You can be Ron DeSantis.
It's true. No, they're very cartoonish. You can be a medical researcher, and the picture is like a woman holding up like a beaker with some sort of green liquid in it.
You could be a protester. You can be birds aren't real guy. Can you be that guy?
Be a fact checker who looks out for misinformation. That's exactly it. But you get to decide where in the world to set up your research stations, and you choose your cards. And
can you be an influencer? Is there one for a Twitter influencer?
You know what?
I want to be an influencer.
I think, John,
because I have important things to say about something. Can I be Joe Rogan? I want to be Joe Rogan in the pandemic.
You know what? There's a lot of money to be made in an updated 2022 version of the game Pandemic, and I'm gonna let you do that because that's a great idea.
You should run with that. That's a good business idea. For the record, at this point, that's at least a safe recommendation. I can't tell you how much I hate board games. There are a few things that I enjoy doing less than games.
You just haven't set up the right atmosphere. You need to have a little nipper, get some whiskey.
You need to text my wife. You can ask her about it. There's no way you're winning this one.
You're such a curmudgeon.
Enjoyable thing.
Oh my word!
I'm not. I like all kinds of things, just not that. Uh-huh. So mine's a little bit more serious. Very excited about a new partnership that we have with Focus on the Family. And it's taking a couple different forms, but one is a brand new speaker series that we're co-hosting together up in the Focus on the Family's bookstore, a new property they have in Holland, Michigan. But it's also something that's going to be live streamed. And as part of this, place, what we're doing is putting together some opportunities to think deeply about family and culture and family and worldview. And so we've got a whole series planned that will be, obviously, if you live in that neighborhood, I think we're at capacity. It's not a huge space, but I think we are at capacity and a waiting list there in Holland, Michigan. But it's also going to be live streamed this coming Tuesday night, and we're going to be doing it for the next 3 months. So February, March, April, and then again in the fall. So 3 in the spring, 3 in the fall. Our first, I'm really excited about the first one. Dr. Anthony Bradley of the King's College will be with us there in Holland. I'll be up there hosting this gathering. Dr. Bradley his Twitter account is one of the more interesting ones that I follow. Don't always agree with everything that he puts out there, but fascinating and very helpful. I had him on the podcast actually probably about a year ago because of what he was talking about when it comes to young men. He actually teaches a class at the King's College on, I forget what he calls it, but basically the whole thing is, look, we are desperately failing young men and we need to figure out how to help young men. Of course, a big part of it has to do with dads. And Dr. Bradley is going to talk about that. The title of the talk is How to Stop Failing Young Men. We want this series to be both educational as well as instructive and constructive. And so it'll be, again, live stream that you can sign up for. I think we've already got 2,000 or 3,000 people signed up to do the live stream. It's this Tuesday night, February the 15th. Starts at 6 p.m. Eastern from Holland, Michigan, or 7 p.m. via live stream is what I'm seeing here. So I don't know how all the backdoor tech is going. I guess it's not a live stream if it's at 7 p.m. But however you do it, you can sign up for it. Go to breakpoint.org and click on the link for this program, or go to the Focus on the Family website, FOTF.org or family.org, and I think you'll find it. The series is called Lighthouse Voices. Lighthouse Voices. If you're on Twitter, you can go to my Twitter account and follow, and I've just tweeted the link to where you can go and sign up for the live stream. So we'd love to have you join us. We're going to be talking about all kinds of important topics from a Christian worldview.
And then after the speaker, you guys will all get together and play Pandemic. That sounds awesome.
We will not. We will not.
Thanks, everybody, so much for being with us today. This has been another episode of BreakPoint This Week from the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I'm Maria Baer alongside John Stone Street. We'll see you all next week.